It was Halloween night, and the party at the infamous Blackridge Manor was destined to be the kind of night whispered about in Hollywood's darkest corners. The host, an enigmatic music mogul known only as D, had a reputation for throwing the most extravagant, exclusive gatherings where celebrities, influencers, and socialites indulged in excess. But this year there was something different in the air. Something electric and wrong. The mansion, an ominous Gothic fortress perched high in the Hollywood Hills, had a history that dripped with scandal and sorrow. And the whispers said this would be the last party ever held within its walls. Limousines glided up the winding driveway, their occupants emerging in costumes designed less for scares and more for spectacle. The mansion stood, silent and waiting, its stone gargoyles looming like watchful sentinels over the revelers below. Inside, red velvet drapes cascaded from the ceilings, candlelight flickered in ornate chandeliers, and antique mirrors lined the walls, their surfaces smudged as if unwilling to reveal what lurked beneath. At the heart of the foyer stood a massive, cracked mirror, a jagged scar running its length. Legends surrounded it, warnings muttered in hushed tones. Don't look too long, it remembers. Some laughed it off, calling it an elaborate prop. Others shuddered, recalling the rumors, stories of people who had stared into its depths and never been the same again. As the night deepened, a group of four, Kate, a social media queen, Logan, her equally famous counterpart, Sam, a rising actor desperate for his big break, and Devin, the self-proclaimed skeptic, found themselves drawn away from the glitz and glamour, their curiosity leading them up a grand, curving staircase to the dimly lit upper halls. The air grew stale. The music from downstairs became distant, distorted as if funneled through some unseen barrier. The hallway they entered was lined with old photographs, black and white. Celebrities from decades past caught mid-laugh, mid-drink. But as they moved past each frame, the eyes in the photographs seemed to follow them. Faces twisted, expressions shifting, ever so slightly. A trick of the light, surely. Then they saw it, the door at the end of the corridor. A brass plaque on the wood, dull with age. The reflection room. What's a Halloween party without a little scare? Kate smirked, pushing it open. Inside, the room was almost bare. No grand furnishings, no chandeliers. Just a single towering mirror. Taller than any of them, its crack deeper than it had seemed downstairs. Like a wound that had never quite healed. A whisper of unease slithered through the air. Still, one by one, they stepped forward. At first, nothing happened. Their reflections stared back, dressed in designer costumes, faces flushed from champagne and bravado. But then, the changes began. Logan saw it first, his reflection shifting, slightly out of sync. A twitch at the corner of the mouth when he hadn't moved. A tilt of the head that felt wrong. He blinked, and his reflected eyes stayed open a second too long. Sam gasped, stumbling back. In the mirror, his throat darkened, bruises blooming like hands tightening around his skin. He clutched his neck, breath coming in ragged gasps, but there were no fingers there, only cold air and the pressure of something unseen. Kate's reflection grinned, a grotesque, unnatural smile stretching wider and wider until her lips cracked, her teeth red with blood. Her real mouth remained frozen in horror, unable to move, unable to scream. Devin tried to turn away, but his body wouldn't obey. His own mirrored self stared at him with hollow, inky black eyes, the pupils swallowed by the void. The reflection raised a hand, fingers twitching, and Devin felt it. Something cold, creeping up his spine, slithering into his bones. The whisper came then, from inside the mirror, from all around them. Welcome, you're ours now. The door slammed shut, the air turned to ice. The shadows in the glass writhed and reached. They clawed, they pulled. Logan was the first to disappear, yanked into the darkness with a choked gasp. Sam followed, his screams cut off the moment his body hit the glass. Kate fought, her nails digging into the floor, but her reflection grinned as it dragged her into the abyss. Devon was the last, his own hands betraying him as they reached forward, trembling, and touched the cold surface. Then, silence. Downstairs, the party raged on. No one noticed the missing guests. No one heard their muffled screams swallowed by the walls. But in the hallway, the photographs had changed. 4 new faces now adorned the frames, their eyes wide, their expressions frozen in terror. And in the grand foyer, the mirror waited, cracked, patient, and hungry for next year's souls. It was a night the boldest of the bold, the fearless thrill-seekers eagerly awaited. The Halloween party at Diddy's mansion. For years, it had been the talk of Hollywood, a dazzling spectacle wrapped in whispers and rumors. But this time, Diddy had promised something beyond the usual. He claimed it would be unforgettable. And there were rumors, dreadful, spine-tingling rumors, that his mansion, the grand one perched at the edge of town, was haunted. But the real mystery lay in the basement no one dared enter. People scoffed, of course. It was just part of Diddy's game, they said, a trick to give the party more drama. After all, who would believe in such nonsense? But Diddy, ever the showman, had warned in no uncertain terms. Anyone foolish enough to even try and sneak into the basement would be thrown out before they could blink. As midnight crept closer, a strange heaviness began to settle over the party. The air turned cooler, the candles flickered a bit too much for comfort, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch longer, more menacing. And then, there was that feeling that something was wrong. The guests near the stairs leading to the basement whispered nervously, claiming they'd heard noises from below. Soft footsteps, a faint humming, and sometimes what sounded like muffled whispers. Most laughed it off. After all, it was Halloween, a time for thrills, for terror. But Sasha, Mick, and Elena weren't like the others. Sasha, the skeptic, was the ringleader. The louder they laughed, the bolder they got. "Haunted basement, my ass," Sasha scoffed, downing another cocktail. "It's just a dusty old storage room, and Diddy probably has speakers set up to freak people out." Mick, slightly tipsy, smirked. "Let's go check it out, then. We'll be legends. You know that's what everyone's going to talk about tomorrow." Elena hesitated. She didn't like the idea, not one bit. But peer pressure is a powerful thing, and before long they found themselves slipping away from the crowd. The basement door was ajar, just enough for them to sneak in without anyone noticing. They crept down the dark staircase, their phones in hand, casting feeble pools of light on the walls. The chill in the air grew sharper the further they descended, and a strange silence settled over them. This wasn't just the stillness of a forgotten place. It felt wrong. The basement stretched out before them, but it wasn't the cluttered storage space they'd expected. No, instead, it was a dimly lit room, empty except for the hundreds of old, faded photographs lining the walls. Mick stopped in his tracks. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. Sasha squinted at the photos. They were unsettling, almost hypnotic. At first glance, they seemed to be pictures of past partygoers, some in costumes, some staring blankly at the camera, but the more they looked, the more familiar the faces became. Faces of celebrities, famous names from the past, many of whom had died under strange circumstances. Sasha laughed, though it sounded forced. Must be part of Diddy's gimmick. Spooky photos to add to the vibe. But then they saw it. A figure, faint and blurred, standing in the corner of one photo. A shadow, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably watching. And it had eyes. Eyes that glowed from within the photo, following them wherever they moved. "What the hell is that?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. Sasha's confidence began to waver. It's just a trick. It's part of the setup. But then they realized something even more terrifying. The figure wasn't just in one photo. It was in every single one. Sometimes it was lurking in the background. Other times, it was disturbingly close to the people in the pictures, its presence almost suffocating. And the more they looked, the more they recognized it. The same dark figure from every image, from every year. Mick's voice shook as he muttered, "I think we should get out of here." They turned to leave, but then they heard it. Footsteps above. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming closer. Panic set in and they immediately turned off their phones, hiding in the shadows. The footsteps grew louder, now descending the stairs. Through the dim light, they saw a figure, a tall, imposing man in an old-fashioned black suit. His face was obscured by a pale, blank mask, but his eyes gleamed through the mask, cold and unfeeling. The figure moved slowly, methodically, scanning the room. Their breath caught in their throats as it stopped right in front of them, its head tilting as if listening for something. Then, with a voice that scraped the air, it whispered, "They never leave, not once they've seen." Suddenly the room seemed to hum, a low vibrating sound that rattled their teeth. The photographs on the wall shifted. Every face turned toward them, frozen in expressions of horror, of fear. The figure stepped back, melding into the shadows as the humming turned into words, a language they couldn't understand but felt deep in their bones. "You never leave once you've seen." Without another thought, they ran. Stumbling, tripping over their feet, they scrambled up the stairs, desperate to escape. But when they reached the top, Sasha looked back. And that was when the blood drained from her face. The figure was at the bottom of the stairs, its eyes glowing faintly, fixed on them. Behind it, the photographs had changed. The faces were no longer frozen in fear. They were screaming, mouths open in terror. They burst through the basement door, slamming it shut behind them, and rushed back into the party, hearts pounding, breath ragged. But no one believed them. Just part of the act, they were told. Diddy's always got some creepy surprise. Even Diddy, when they found him, merely smirked. "I told you not to go down there," he said, his voice strangely hollow. The night blurred after that, but one thing was clear. They couldn't shake the image of that figure, nor the voices they had heard in the basement. The nightmares came first. At first, they were just dreams. Dreams of being trapped in that basement, of seeing the shadowy figure lurking just beyond their vision, its eyes always on them. But the dreams didn't stop. Week after week they came, each one more vivid, more suffocating than the last. And then came the photographs. At first it was subtle, shifting ever so slightly. But soon they began to change. The faces in the photos on their walls, the shadows in their homes, the feeling of something watching them. As Halloween approached the following year, each of them received an invitation in the mail. There was no return address, just a single line printed in cold, stark lettering. "You can never leave once you've seen," and the nightmares, they never stopped. Each year, the Halloween night at Diddy's mansion became a whispered legend of its own. The guest list was an exclusive web woven with the finest threads of Hollywood's elite, each one hand-picked for the promise of glamour and excess. Yet there was always something off about that night, something dark lurking beneath the glitz. It was more than just a party. It was a ritual, a game. And every year more souls were drawn into its orbit, unable to escape once they had been chosen. But what was more disturbing than the sheer scale of the event was the faint buzz of talk about the mansion's darkest secret, a ritual held precisely at 3 o'clock in the morning. A séance held in a room hidden from prying eyes, tucked away on the 3rd floor behind velvet curtains and locked doors. only those daring or foolish enough had ever witnessed it. Those who did never talked about it. By the time the clock ticked past 2 a.m., the house had become something else, something living, breathing, waiting. The glimmer of laughter and clinking glasses grew hollow, empty, as though the very walls of the mansion hung on the cusp of something terrible. Guests started whispering of strange happenings, whispers in the corners of rooms, shadows that moved without source, chills that had no business being felt on an October night. They laughed it off, but deep down, they all knew there was something wrong in that house. Among the guests, 3 stood out. Sasha, an influencer whose life was built on searching for the paranormal. James, a rising actor whose career had been guided by curiosity, and Lena, a journalist who lived for the next big story, were drawn to the stories they'd heard, the shadows, the whispers, and the undeniable pull of the unknown. As the hours wore on, they grew restless, driven by a shared compulsion, an itch that demanded to be scratched. They couldn't ignore it. They had to see the séance for themselves. At 2:30 a.m., the 3 found themselves caught in a current that was impossible to resist. A man, dressed in an old-fashioned tuxedo, approached them discreetly. He handed them an invitation. No words, just a slip of paper with a symbol none of them recognized. They were chosen. Without a word, they followed him, weaving through the maze of rooms until they reached a door, old and weathered, at the end of a dimly lit hallway. The door creaked open, revealing a small, cluttered room with walls draped in dark velvet. In the center was a round table surrounded by 6 chairs. 5 of them were occupied, their faces shadowed and unmoving. But Diddy, he was nowhere to be seen. The air was thick, oppressive, and the moment they crossed the threshold, a sense of foreboding coiled around them, squeezing tight. The medium, a woman with hollow eyes and a voice that seemed to belong to something far older than her body, stood before them. Her voice was like the rasp of dry leaves, murmuring words in a language none of them could understand. The room grew colder with every syllable, until they could feel their own breath coming out in misty clouds. And then, the words shifted. "They're here," the medium rasped, her eyes rolling back in her head. The silent guests. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow, stretching and twisting, reaching toward them with a hunger that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand. Lena felt a shiver run down her spine, and James instinctively reached for Sasha's hand. But Sasha, she wasn't scared. No, she'd seen it all, or so she thought. The medium's voice dropped to a whisper. "They want to be seen. They want out." The temperature in the room dropped, and each of them could feel the chill deep in their bones. Then the humming began, soft at first, like the eerie lullaby of something not quite human, but it grew louder, darker, twisting into something otherworldly. The shadows on the walls began to take form, faces contorted and drawn, each one staring at them with eyes that held the weight of 1,000 years of torment, faces that looked too familiar, faces of people long dead but still trapped within the walls. James was the first to speak, his voice trembling. "What are they? Are they real?" The medium turned to him with a twisted smile. "These are the silent guests," she said, her eyes empty voids. "They are bound to this house. They were drawn here once, just like you. Curious souls who went too far, who saw too much." Sasha tried to laugh it off, but her voice faltered as she saw one of the figures move, its face twisted in agony, its hands reaching out for her. It was the kind of touch that made her skin crawl, cold, damp, desperate. "They want you." The medium's voice barely reached her ears. "They will never let you leave." The humming grew louder, a relentless, maddening chant that filled every corner of the room, every cell of their bodies. Lena squeezed her eyes shut, but even through the darkness she could see them. The silent guests emerging from the walls, their eyes fixed on her, cold and empty. Sasha tried to pull away, but the shadows followed her, silent and relentless. She felt the touch again, colder this time, like ice. It was all-consuming. Panic set in. They had to get out. They had to leave. But as they turned toward the door, it wouldn't open. It was locked. Trapped. The silent guests closed in, their faces filling the walls, their hollow eyes searching, hungry. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She turned to James, only to find him frozen in place, eyes wide with terror. And then, in a single moment of clarity, Sasha understood. The guests were looking for replacements. They weren't just haunting the mansion, they were feeding on the curious, the brave, the reckless. Suddenly the door swung open. A single gust of wind, as cold as death, rushed in. They stumbled out, breathless, their bodies shaking with terror. But the house wasn't done with them. It wasn't done with any of them. The hallway was empty, as if nothing had happened. The party went on, as if they hadn't just come face to face with the darkness that had lived in the mansion for centuries. They tried to tell Diddy, tried to warn him. But when they found him, all he did was smile. Almost pityingly. "I warned you not to go upstairs." The weeks that followed were a blur of nightmares. Shadows that moved when they weren't looking. Faces that stared at them from reflections. The silent guests had mocked them. They had seen too much. And now, they would never escape. Until the day they too would be trapped in the walls of the mansion, bound by the same curse, forever part of the house. As Halloween approached the following year, they received their invitations. No names, no return address. Just a single line. "You can never leave once you've seen." And the silent guests, they waited. Halloween night had arrived at Blackridge Manor, and the whispers among the Hollywood elite had already started. For years, Dee, the reclusive music mogul, had built a reputation for throwing the most extravagant, unforgettable parties. Each year, celebrities and influencers alike flocked to the mansion, not just for the lavish debauchery, but for the mystique that seemed to cling to the place like the dust of ancient secrets. But tonight was different. There was an unsettling buzz in the air, a kind of anticipation that pulsed through the heavy atmosphere, thick with dread. Blackridge Manor was perched on a jagged cliff, overlooking the darkened city below, its towering spires and Gothic arches cutting a silhouette against the moon. From its windows, the flickering candlelight of the revelers below barely pierced the darkness of the mansion's interior, leaving the place cloaked in shadow and mystery. But despite the crowd below, the place felt empty. The walls of the manor seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting for something or someone to break the silence. Limousines rolled up the winding drive like sleek black serpents, disgorging their famous occupants in all manner of bizarre and extravagant costumes. A parade of masks and painted smiles glided past the iron gates, but none seemed to notice the faint hum in the air, a vibration that seemed to tremble the very ground beneath their feet. Inside, the guests were draped in luxury, with laughter and clinking glasses filling the air. Yet there was an edge to it all, a sense of nervousness, as though no one could quite shake the feeling that something was waiting for them. The mansion itself seemed to pulse with a dark energy, from the eerie way the red velvet curtains hung like blood-stained shrouds, to the way the antique mirrors caught reflections that weren't their own. At the center of it all stood the cracked mirror, its jagged break running the length of its surface like a wound that had never healed. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and yet no one dared to question its purpose. There were rumors about the mirror, dark, whispered stories. They said it remembered, it didn't forget, and those who stared into it for too long, well, no one really knew what happened to them after that. A brass plaque, dull and tarnished by age, was mounted on the doorframe. The reflection room. Well, what's a Halloween party without a little scare? Kate said, smirking as she pushed the door open. Her voice echoed in the stillness of the hallway, only adding to the unease that had begun to settle in their chests. Inside, the room was barren. No ornate furniture, no decorations, just an immense mirror standing like a silent sentinel in the center of the room. The crack in the glass was deeper than any of them had noticed before, running down its length like a dark river of time. There was something wrong about it, something ancient, something hungry. Still, they couldn't resist. One by one, they stepped closer to the glass. At first, the reflections were normal, too normal. Kate adjusted her hair, Logan checked his watch, and Sam grinned, his reflection matching every move. But then, the change began. Subtle at first, like a glitch in reality. Logan was the first to notice. His reflection smiled, but not at the same time he did. His mouth stretched a second too long, and his eyes, flickered, darkened, as if they were someone else's. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest, but when he blinked, the reflection didn't. It stayed there, eyes wide and unblinking, a second too long. Sam's voice broke the silence, his breath coming in shallow, panic-stricken gasps. In the mirror, his neck was bruised, purple marks blooming across his skin like a noose tightening around his throat. He reached up to touch it, only to find his skin smooth and unmarked. But in the glass, the pressure was real, suffocating. Kate's laugh came out as a tremor, her reflection grinning with too many teeth, a smile that stretched impossibly wide, the skin around her mouth splitting open. Her real face froze in horror as her reflection cackled, blood staining her teeth. Devon's reflection did not mirror him at all. It stared at him with hollow, black eyes, the pupils swallowed by a bottomless void. His own reflection raised a hand, fingers twitching. Devon wanted to move, but his legs wouldn't obey him. His body froze, the chill creeping up his spine, and something cold seemed to crawl up his bones, as if the very air had turned to ice. Then came the whisper, low, a rasp that vibrated through the glass. "Welcome. You are ours now." The door slammed shut. They spun around, hearts racing, but there was no escape. The shadows in the mirror began to move, shifting and slithering. Then, like a tide, they reached out. Logan was the first to be claimed. His body jerked as if yanked by invisible hands, a strangled cry torn from his throat as he was dragged into the glass. Sam followed, his scream swallowed by the void as he disappeared, his body sucked into the mirror with a sickening thud. Kate's nails scraped against the floor as she fought, but her reflection dragged her forward, grinning as she was pulled into the cold glass. Her last scream echoed as the shadows closed in. Devon was the last. His reflection reached out, icy fingers grazing his arm. He tried to turn away, but his own hands betrayed him, reaching forward and touching the glass. The moment his fingers made contact, the world around him collapsed into darkness. And then there was silence. Downstairs, the party continued without a hitch, unaware of the horrors unfolding upstairs. No one noticed the 4 missing guests. No one heard their muffled screams, trapped within the walls of the mansion. But in the hallway, the photographs had changed. 4 new faces stared out from the frames, their eyes wide with terror, frozen in their final desperate moments. And in the foyer, the mirror waited, cracked, patient, hungry for the next souls to wander too close.